So today on the podcast, I have two things for you. First, we have the next installment in our series, Screenwriting with Walt, which looks at Walt Disney, screenwriter Larry Watkin, and the early Disney films. This week, we'll look at stories about the making of Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which was one of the most significant live-action films produced by Walt, along with Mary Poppins and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. By the late 1950s, the public identified Disney live-action features with historical dramas, as nearly all of the Disney live-action offerings fell into this category at that time. To be completely honest, Darby O'Gill does have some hand-drawn effects animation, such as the ghostly fog around spirits or lightning that rises from King Brian's whip like magic. But aside from this is a wholly live-action film. Maybe a better way to phrase this is, in Darby O'Gill, there are no hand-drawn animated characters. But unlike previous Disney live-action features, Darby O'Gill sought to place some of the fanciful wonders that the public associated with Disney animation into a live-action production. This would be accomplished through technically complex special effects. In part of today's episode, we'll talk about how, back during production in 1958, in a world long before studios used computers, this was accomplished on the Disney lot. I also have a number of little-known stories about the production of the film. The other thing I have for you today is a video. For the last 2 weeks on the podcast, in our news and analysis episodes, we've talked about how the political and financial climate around the Disney company has been changing in such a way to allow for new attraction areas and new attractions to be developed at the American parks. Some of those areas are presently under construction. In the past year or so, a few listeners have written in to ask for some visuals to accompany some of our stories about the parks. So, in this video, I will walk you through every construction and development area at the American resorts. We'll look at all 6 of the American Disney parks and also the resort areas themselves, as together we take a look at how construction is developing on a dozen projects currently being developed in the Disney parks. All of the footage is current and was shot during the first 2 weeks of April. I'll leave a direct link for the video down in our show notes today. And also, as you probably know, you can find all of our podcast videos with the most recent one up on top on our video landing page, which is DHIpodcast.com. In about 8 minutes, I explain each development and show you current video footage of where construction stands right now. Lastly, before we get going today, I need to thank a few more Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. I am deeply grateful for each of you who supports us over on Bandcamp, because without you, this podcast simply wouldn't exist. Thanks today are going out to new subscribers, Melissa, Bandcamp Kirk, Dubis, Nick, and Mr. Cotton's Parrot. Thanks to each of you for supporting all the things we do here. And now, let's kick in to today's show. With a finished script in hand and a director in place for Darby O'Gill, Walt focused then on finding the exact right cast to make the story come to life. In the winter of 1957, Walt traveled to England and Ireland to fill lead roles. In England, he found dozens of qualified actors for each role, nearly all of whom made contact through their agents. More so than when casting for previous films related to the British Isles, Walt saw that there was now a deep interest in the Disney project, that scores of local actors who, through the example of Treasure Island, Robin Hood, and other projects, saw that a Disney picture was a tried and true way for British actors to advance their careers and find an audience far beyond the UK. For the role of Darby, Walt hoped to hire Barry Fitzgerald, Hollywood's best-known Irish actor, famous for his work in the film The Quiet Man, where he played a matchmaker encouraging a relationship between a newcomer to Ireland and a local girl. For that project, Fitzgerald appeared as a believable member of a 1920s Irish village right down to his mannerisms and speech. For Disney, ideally, he would play two roles, Darby and the 20-inch high King of the Leprechauns, King Brian. When the two characters were in the same scene, the Disney crew would create the footage through the use of split screens, stage doubles, and other effects. But Fitzgerald, who had recently turned 70 and was not in the best of health, turned down the role. From there, Walt considered his other options. He needed an older Irish actor who appeared mirthful and deeply likable on screen. In this, he recalled seeing an actor nearly a decade earlier, Albert Sharp, on the Broadway stage, where he held the lead in Finian's Rainbow, another story about an older Irish gentleman and a leprechaun. Following his success on Broadway, Sharp appeared in a Hollywood film of Brigadoon, and then following this production he retired at the age of 69 and settled into Belfast, the town where he had been born and where he now watched the world move on around him. As part of a casting tour of England and Ireland, Walt made his way to Belfast, where, according to Sharp, he visited him at home. He was just about to turn 73. Walt explained the project and the role he had in mind for Sharp. It took a moment for the news to sink in. "Oh my goodness," Sharp said. "I thought everyone had forgotten me." For the role of Katie, Walt talked with many hopefuls, most of whom were part of West End theater life in London. He reviewed the work of dozens of young women, all of whom were roughly 20 years old, before he came across Janet Munro. "The casting for that film was the talk of the theatrical group," she said. "That he was in town and already had interviewed 50 girls when my agent called to say he'd made an appointment for me. I went in fear and trembling. We tested for 2 days, then Mr. Disney thanked me and said, 'We're looking forward to having you over there.' But I didn't know definitively for 2 weeks." Munro had been raised by a single father, a stage entertainer. During World War II, her father, Alex Munro, oversaw Royal Air Force entertainment in England. In 1941 or 1942, at the age of 7, Janet Munro performed alongside her father for audiences mostly comprised of soldiers. After the war ended, she returned to school but still performed as part of her father's variety and comedy act. She loved being on stage. One night while leaving the theater, her father looked up at the sky, where lights were sugared across the heavens, then singled one out, which he said was now her star. "Keep that star," he said. Then his eyes lowered to take in his daughter. "Until you're one yourself." For years, she worked in British TV and on the stage. In 1956, she was married. In 1957, she was crowned Miss TV, largely for roles where she played perky, innocent girls. At this time, she wanted to climb up out of this role, which she saw as a bit of typecasting. After 2 years of marriage, she was separated from her husband and now moving through a divorce. "It's much more interesting to play Good Girls Gone Wrong," she said, just weeks before meeting Walt Disney. With her marriage now ending, she wanted to move into adult roles where characters had complex motivation. "Goody-goody parts are a bore," she added. Ultimately, Disney signed Janet Munro to a multi-picture contract similar to the one given a decade earlier to Bobby Driscoll, the child star of So Dear to My Heart and Treasure Island. For Munro, one of the drawbacks was that for Disney, she would likely be placed into a series of late adolescent roles, exactly how she had been typecast in England. She was 23 and wanted her on-screen performance to reflect the maturity of her off-screen personality. To reframe her public image, she went so far as to pose in a skin-tight bathing suit. One interviewer described her as an auburn-haired, emerald-eyed lady with the carbonated energy of champagne. The Disney studio, of course, would never mention her marriage and recent divorce in any press materials, but the Disney offer was a spectacular opportunity. "It's an amazing contract, too," she explained. "I'm to make one movie a year for 5 years for Walt, and I can do any other work I want to do." In her first year, it would actually be 2 movies. Darby, which shot in the spring and part of the summer, and then Third Man on the Mountain, scheduled to shoot in the summer in Switzerland. The problem was, as she knew well, with her perky face and dewy eyes, she looked younger than her actual age and would be asked to play young women whose life experience was far more limited than her own. The last major role, at least for the human characters, was for Michael McBride, the young man who in the story was being groomed to take over Darby's role as caretaker of Lord Fitzpatrick's estate, the young man who would also fall in love with Darby's daughter. This role would go to a 27-year-old, relatively unknown actor, Sean Connery, who was then under contract with Fox, though he'd yet to make a single Hollywood picture. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, he had grown up in a Celtic culture similar to that of Ireland and could easily pass on screen as Irish. He had worked for 5 years in the theater and then, when he was 26 years old, appeared in a live British TV production of Requiem for a Heavyweight, his first major role, which aired in 1957. From there, he signed a contract with Fox. Even before Connery ever stepped foot in California, at Walt's request, Fox loaned him out to Disney for Darby O'Gill. With this, Walt now had his 3 lead actors. Other roles, including the King of the Leprechauns, would largely be filled with character actors from either Ireland or the UK. During these same months, at the Burbank studio, the director, Robert Stevenson, and the crew found that the pre-production challenges were mostly focused on working out how special effects scenes would be shot. To make Larry Watkin's script a photorealistic presentation, a team of Disney artists and technicians proposed a series of special effects techniques. Forced perspective was used to create the illusion that human actors portraying leprechauns were less than 2 feet tall when standing beside Albert Sharp, the actor who played Darby, with Sharp in the foreground and the leprechaun actors far behind. The camera operator would stop down the aperture, decreasing the amount of light that entered the iris of a lens, which widened the field of focus. With a smaller aperture setting, foreground and background elements were equally in focus, whereas with a wide aperture, foreground elements would be in focus while background elements would fade into a lovely haze. But this effect required that the camera remain stationary. Only when it was stationary, with its iris closed down, did it offer the illusion that a full-sized Albert Sharp was much larger than the leprechauns who appeared to stand next to him, but were in reality many feet further from the camera. To pan or tilt the camera would reveal that the image was an illusion created by the placement of the actors. But Stevenson wondered if there wasn't some way to allow the camera some movement during these effect shots. Stevenson brought his concerns to Ub Iwerks, who oversaw the machine shop. After considering the problem, Iwerks said, "Yes, there's a way to solve that." But also the solution was complicated. Iwerks explained that on a traditional camera, the lens is integrated into the camera body, with focusing being arranged by turning the lens. This affected the nodal point where light rays passed each other. Refocusing the lens would change the nodal point and reveal the space between the actors. "What we'll do," Iwerks said, "is take the lens off the camera and put it in a solid rigid mount that's adjustable, so that we can locate the nodal point at the center of rotation of the pan and tilt motions of the head. The lens will stay stationary and will focus the camera body instead." From there, Iwerks worked with Bob Otto, an engineer who drew up plans for a modified camera, plans that were then built by the machine shop. The modified camera allowed for a variety of lenses, but as the focusing was done outside of the lens, the operator had some freedom to pan and tilt the camera, creating far more natural cinematic movements that could be used during sophisticated effect shots. Beyond the modified cameras, the Disney team developed other techniques that created highly believable effects that could be captured on film. Mirrors with part of the reflective backing scraped off were used to blend images of leprechauns with Darby. Giant props, such as shoes, jugs, and chairs, were placed beside the leprechauns, making them appear small. Lifelike leprechaun puppets with their backs to the camera were used in the foreground or midground to better blend the human characters with the leprechaun actors filmed at a distance. Lastly, pneumatic puppets, that is, puppets whose limbs were controlled by air moving through hidden tubes, were created for some scenes, such as when Darby captures a leprechaun and places him in a burlap bag. The wiggling figure inside that bag was a pneumatic puppet. All of these shots, moment by moment, were carefully planned out by Stevenson. The on-stage effects would add weeks to the production schedule, but without strong planning, they could add months. Another concern was the overall design of the film, as it would blend fantasy with realistic settings. By now, Disney had absorbed many artists and technicians from its UK productions into the studio. Among them was matte painter Peter Ellenshaw. All of his professional life, Ellenshaw had specialized in recreating realistic vistas for film productions. For Treasure Island, he recreated an 18th century harbor filled with ships. For Robin Hood, he recreated a medieval castle atop a hill. His paintings, precisely arranged on glass, were positioned in front of a camera so that the camera would capture both the painted elements, for example, that castle atop a hill, and through sections where the clear glass was unpainted, the performance of live actors, for example, the merry men walking along a path. His skill was not only in creating photorealistic paintings, but also arranging those elements so precisely that the painted sections merged exactly with the live-action set, creating a blended image comprised of live-action and art. But he was initially stymied by aspects of the Darby O'Gill assignment. Typically, he would rely on research to inform his paintings. He had no trouble creating visual concepts for Darby's house and the Irish village. But aspects of this project, particularly designing the underground kingdom of the leprechauns, asked him to imagine what such a place looked like. "I had come to a grinding halt with this sketch," Ellenshaw explained. "Could come up with nothing worthwhile, a complete blank." The solution, as Walt saw it, was to pair Ellenshaw with Don DeGrady, a layout artist and production designer who had worked on many animated features going back to Dumbo, which had been released in 1941. Ellenshaw had the technical and creative ability to produce highly detailed and immersive matte paintings. DeGrady had the ability, like most in the animation units, to imagine scenarios wholesale, based on a brief description. "Don listened to what we needed," Ellenshaw said, "and in a very short time came up with the design, sketched it on paper, and in a few minutes it was there. I took it and made a color rendering. That was a simple task, after the original design was made." The Leprechaun's throne room, under the combined work of Ellenshaw and DeGrady, became a cave of wonders, filled with icicle-shaped stalagmites that surrounded the golden throne, a chair with a tall back, one that was partially covered with crimson cloth. The cave of the little people was the kingpin to the whole film, he said. During filming on the enormous Soundstage 3, the high-backed throne would be a physical prop, over 30 feet tall, large enough for the king of the leprechauns to dance on its wide wooden arm. For this production, the oversized props would be roughly 4 times the size of their real-world actors, as leprechauns were roughly 1/4 the size of humans. Other physical props in the cave scene included a giant gold chalice and some of those stalagmites arranged on wheeled bases. Behind these props, and also behind the actors, would be an enormously tall and long hand-painted backdrop that presented the distant depths of the caves, a backdrop that nearly covered one full wall of the open stage. But other aspects of the cave, particularly those in the foreground and also above the set, essentially where in real life the catwalks and the 600 overhead lights were arranged, would be brushed out on glass by Ellen Shaw. The finished pane, some of which was painted, some of which was clear, would be positioned before the camera. From there, the camera, managed by a skilled cinematographer, would composite all of these elements, the painted backdrop, the props and actors, and the glass mat, into a perfect shot that appeared as a unified and realistic image of a wondrous cave. Early in March, actors began to arrive in Burbank for costume fittings, to rehearse, and to prepare for production. Albert Sharp arrived in California on March 9th. After exiting customs, he was greeted by Clara Jensen, Queen of the Irish-American Society's St. Patrick's Day Ball, and a group of Irish bagpipe players. For him, work on the film would begin the following week, on Monday, March 17th, which appropriately was St. Patrick's Day. As he was in his 70s, he found that acting now tired him quickly, but he also suspected that this might be his finest role. "Walt Disney has given me my greatest chance in acting," he said. "This character, Darby O'Gill, would live forever." At about the same time, Sean Connery, who had never previously visited the States, flew to America, mostly to be overwhelmed by the vastness of Los Angeles and the glitz of Hollywood. When he arrived at the studio, he was stopped at the gate because security guards didn't recognize him. "I eventually got a parking place," he explained. "The first day I was there, I met Walt." From the start, he had the feeling that Walt liked him. Disney arranged for most of the Irish actors, the male actors at least, to stay at the same San Fernando hotel, not far from the studio. Connery, who had never worked on a Hollywood film, assumed that this simply was how most movies were made, with most everyone put up in a nearby hotel in the fashion of an upscale summer camp. "All the Irish were in the same place," he said. "Dennis O'Day, Albert Sharp was there. Jimmy O'Day, who played the King of the Leprechauns, used to drink scotch and ginger ale. We used to play chess out on the poolside at night. We cooked and everything in the rooms. It was like a commune." The film's young female star, Janet Munro, who didn't drive, was not housed with the guys. She was placed in a house that was just down the street from the studio, allowing her to walk to and from work. This was easy to arrange because by 1958, the Disney studio on both its north and east sides was surrounded by post-war suburban developments, mostly one-story houses along with a few apartment buildings. The Disney studio, with all its fantasy and wonders, was now hemmed in by middle-class American life. Shortly after Munro arrived in California, her father, still performing in England, sent her a letter filled with advice. Included in this letter was a list that he called the 8 Commandments for Hollywood films, or rather a guide to making the most of her good luck. The letter might have also been to bolster her spirits as she entered the world now as a newly single woman. The 8th commandment was, "Be a world star." Munro understood her position perfectly. The Disney contract, as good as it was, would keep her in the role of late adolescent girls interested in love for at least 2 pictures, likely more. Her face and appearance lent themselves to roles of young women. Still, she wanted her performance to hold a slightly more mature tone. On the Disney set, she infused small notes of sexuality into her role as Katie, little reminders that her range extended far beyond that of the innocent country girl who takes care of her elderly father. Around the studio, she was quickly known as someone who wanted to have a good time, both on and off set. "Well, I enjoy life," she said, "and why not? Any fool can go around being miserable." One day, while in costume, which was a peasant blouse, full skirt and apron, she curtsied to a reporter, who expected her personality to be more or less the same as her on-screen counterpart. But Munro wanted the reporter to know that she was 23, even though in costume she looked to be a teenager. "Sex takes a holiday," she said, implying that her true personality was only temporarily hidden by this costume. Then she continued toward the stage where, once deeply in character, she would shoot that day's scenes. Because of the high level of special effects shots, production moved slowly. Some shots could be arranged with oversized props and by placing the camera up on a raised platform. For example, the King of the Leprechauns could be placed on an oversized chair, making him appear small. To emphasize this effect, the camera would be placed on a platform about 20 feet above ground to shoot in a downward angle so that the finished shot appeared as though an average-sized person were looking down at a regular chair on which sat a tiny figure. Only the chair was enormous and the camera was high up in the air. But on screen, the effect was perfect. Another effect was accomplished by using a split screen. A cat in close-up could be filmed through the left-hand side of a lens, while the right-hand side of the lens was covered, protecting the raw footage, and then the King of the Leprechauns could be filmed at a distance on the right side, while the left-hand side of the lens was covered. If the backgrounds were perfectly matched, the finished shot would present a cat staring menacingly at a tiny leprechaun. But other shots were far more complicated to produce. When Darby was filmed talking to a leprechaun, Darby typically stood a few feet from the camera, while the leprechaun was placed 25 feet away. Seen on film with the aperture and lighting arranged correctly, it appeared that Darby was about 4 times the size of the leprechaun. But because Darby and the leprechaun weren't actually standing together, the actors needed to line up their sight lines correctly as though they were looking each other in the eye. On the stage, Darby stared down at the empty ground, and the leprechaun looked up at the catwalk, but their eye lines needed to be perfectly placed so that on film it appeared they were genuinely engaged in a meaningful conversation. To make sure that the eye lines matched up, the crew would set up the shot, estimate the correct sight lines, and then place a printed star on the ground or the wall where Albert Sharp should focus his gaze. A similar star was placed on the other side of the room for the leprechaun. In shooting these scenes, both actors would need to imagine the other before them while having the unique experience of having a conversation with a person perhaps 25 feet away, a person whose voice they could barely hear. Another problem related to these effect shots was the high level of illumination required to bathe the leprechauns in light. If light was at the same level across the entire stage, Darby, who was closer to the camera, would appear far brighter than the leprechaun behind him. To acerbate these problems, these shots were arranged with a camera whose lens was stopped down, allowing it the ability to focus on foreground and background elements, but at the cost of limiting the amount of light that entered the camera. To fix this problem, leprechauns needed to be lit with far more intense bulbs than Darby, allowing the light to unify them as though they were side by side. For grand shots in which Darby played the fiddle for dozens of leprechauns, all of the leprechauns needed to be lit with such intensity, the stage began to feel like Palm Springs. At times, technicians would simultaneously oversee nearly 650 lights, more than on any previous Disney production. "It was a very hot set," said Peter Allen Shaw, "and many times we'd have to close down because it became too hot." The lights drew so much power that at one point, nearby neighborhoods around the studio experienced a brownout. Lights in nearby homes, due to insufficient electricity, would grow dim, followed by those on the studio. Albert Sharp, who at the grandfatherly age of 73 was quickly beloved by the crew and the rest of the cast. Walt took to him as well. The production with all of its special effects and reshoots took a toll on Sharp. At times he became ill during production, likely a reaction to the workload, and repeatedly visited the hospital on weekends. He was actually quite ill during production, Ellen Shaw recalled. It was always a concern whether or not he would be able to finish the picture. Though not all actors had stand-ins, one was provided for Sharp as well as some of the other actors, which allowed him to rest away from the set as the crew readied complex shots. In the early afternoon, he liked to take a nap in his studio trailer. One afternoon, a tractor operator arrived to move the trailer from a parking lot next to the outdoor sets to one next to the sound stages, not realizing that Sharp was inside asleep. Sharp slept through some of the noise of the trailer's hitch being joined with the tractor, but then as the trailer lurched forward and rolled over rough ground, he woke up. "First thing I knew, I landed on the ground where I hung on for dear life," he said. "It was worse than riding in the Grand National." He was shaken but not injured, but it was a story that was quickly passed around the lot, one that made the aging actor appear even more sympathetic. At times, particularly for the American crew, he would relate stories about his life in Ireland, including the time he heard a banshee. "Well, I'll never forget a particular night when I was a little boy visiting my grandmother," he began. "The scream awakened me in the dark of the early morning. At first it seemed very shrill, very close. Then it drifted a bit and finally faded away, although it must have lasted 5 minutes. A few days after hearing the sound, Sharp learned that a member of a local family died, roughly around the time of the banshee's scream. And as a boy, he had believed that this had been a sign that death was coming. It was stories like this that made most around him, even Walt, view him as the ideal actor to play Darby, a man who had similar obsessions of fairy folks and spirits. Beyond his age and declining health, Sharp faced a number of challenges in playing the role. One of these challenges involved the fiddle. Darby, as an Irish storyteller, was supposed to play the fiddle throughout the film, but Sharp himself had no musical ability. When he was far from the camera, he could easily fake playing the fiddle, moving the bow and arranging his fingers on the fingerboard. But for close-ups, for anyone in the audience who had ever played a stringed instrument, this would appear fake. The solution was to hire 2 professional violinists who would be dressed in gray jackets identical to the one worn by Darby. One of the violinists would crouch behind Darby and lift up his right hand to move the bow. The other would curve his left hand around the fingerboard, arranging his fingers for various chords, while Sharp himself let his arms fall loosely behind his back and held the fiddle in place by pinning it between his chin and shoulder. Another concern involved how Sharp would deliver dialogue with his brogue accent. Robert Stevenson and others were of 2 minds as to how to present his speech. His brogue might be understandable for American adults, but might present a challenge for children. But on the other hand, his accent made the film feel more authentic, not like a film shot a few hundred feet away from the Disney Animation Building in Burbank. The compromise was for Sharp and some of the other Irish actors to limit their accent. That is, they were directed to include the light flavor of Irish speech, but also to Americanize their pronunciation to the point where it would be easily understood. "Now, Albert," Walt told him, "we have to understand you." But according to producer Bill Anderson, Walt became more interested in Albert's overall performance and allowed some of the strong brogue speech patterns to remain in the film. Because of the onstage special effects and trick shots, filming lasted for months. Many of the actors came and went from their hotel, one town over, which now felt like a home. During lulls in production, Walt sent some of the cast and crew, particularly those from overseas, out to experience Southern California. The group typically included Sean Connery and Janet Munro, but not Albert Sharp, who spent time away from the studio resting. Ken Anakin, who was developing Third Man on the Mountain, recalled that one day, when Walt was particularly pleased with production, he said, "We've had a good week. Why don't we go out to my box at the Santa Anita track?" It was the exact type of loud American outing that would have been unique to some of the younger stars from overseas. Walt sent us out there, Anakin continued, with $100 each gambling money. Among the group was Sean Connery, who had never previously visited America, and Munro, who had visited only once previously. It was just a throwaway on Walt's part, Anakin added. He was a very warm, friendly person, really, as long as he felt that you were pulling your weight. At another point in production, a group of actors went to Disneyland, where they enjoyed the rides and posed for photos. For some of the overseas cast, Disneyland appeared as an otherworldly wonder, something so unlike the pleasure gardens and Coney Island-like amusement parks they had back in the UK. At one point, Connery and Munro squeezed themselves into an Autopia car together, Connery behind the wheel and Munro as passenger. Toward the end of the ride, as the cars were lined up at the station, a photographer lifted a camera to take the picture. The two together raised their hands in comic surprise, as though they were letting the car briefly drive itself. The photo with Connery and Munro grinning perfectly captured the exuberance the two felt while working on Darby O'Gill, a film that would not only change their careers, but also change the future direction of live-action films created by Disney. I'll be back next week with a new episode, most likely to wrap up this story about Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and the early Disney live-action features created back in the 1950s. And remember, there's a new video up in which I walk you through construction and development areas at all 6 of the American parks. So if you live far from Disneyland or Disney World, you can see everything that's being developed right now. You can also see how sharply different various development areas are at Disneyland compared to Disney World. There's a direct link to this video down in our show notes today. You can also find it on our landing page, which is dhipodcast.com. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you will find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us on Bandcamp is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.